morning and happy Mother's Day. My wish for all of us, my affirmation, is that each of us is going to find today the right and perfect way to honor our mothers and perhaps just as importantly, the mother figures in our lives. This holiday is relatively young when you think about it. It's only 105 years old. And it's all because of a very determined woman from West Virginia named Anna Jarvis, who wanted to dedicate a day to honor all mothers on the anniversary of her own mother's death. And she was a force to be reckoned with. After much letter writing and politicking, in 1914, President Woodrow Wilson proclaimed the second Sunday in May as Mother's Day. And then it caught on all around the world. They do the same thing in Denmark and Finland, Italy, Turkey, Australia, Belgium, and on the second Sunday in May, just like we do here. Now, I heard something interesting this morning. I heard that Anna Jarvis became extremely upset that the floral industry got a hold of Mother's Day and treated it as an excuse to get people to go out and buy flowers. She was not happy about that and ended up kind of boycotting the holiday that she helped to get put in place all the way back there in 1914. So there was a problem with commercialism from the very get-go of this holiday. Interesting. 1914. Think about 1914. There's a day set aside to honor mothers, and women in this country still couldn't vote. Hard to imagine. But the authorities in power back in those days were convinced that they had very good reasons why women should not be allowed to vote. And it wasn't just the men who were opposed. There were women who were part of the anti-suffrage movement as well. Case in point, Josephine Dodge. There she is. Josephine Dodge. In 1911, she founded the National Association Opposed to Woman Suffrage. This is one of her pamphlets that she had put out. I'll read it to you for those who can't see the small print. It says, "Danger, women's suffrage would double the irresponsible vote." A 1911 pamphlet. It is a menace to the home, men's employment, and to all business. And I'm going to read the real small print down here. This was put out by an outfit called Progress Publishing Company. That there is what you call an oxymoron, right? Emphasis on the moron. Progress Publishing Company. This goes to show you that demagoguery, bigotry, and Orwellian jaw-dropping stupidity are nothing new when it comes to politics. It was going on back then. And if your jaw hasn't dropped enough yet, I have one more of those Progress Publication little gems, these little pamphlets with reasons why women couldn't vote. Let's put that up here. I'll read this to you. It's interesting. Vote no on women's suffrage because 90% of the women either do not want it or do not care, because it means competition of women with men instead of cooperation, because 80% of the women eligible to vote are married and can only double or annul their husband's votes. Are you getting this? Because it can be of no benefit commensurate with the additional expense involved, because in some states, more voting women than men will place the government under petticoat rule. I am not making this up. This is an actual thing that went around. And finally, because it is unwise to risk the good we already have for the evil which might occur. And notice over there, they sent this out under the guise of household hints. I mean, we laugh. We don't know whether to laugh or cry when you see something like that. That's what people really believed. That's the kind of thing that persuaded people to keep women from getting the vote. all the way up until the 19th Amendment was passed in 1920. It was difficult to persuade people to change their minds. Once they were indoctrinated with this stuff, it was tough. But fortunately, the majority of people in this country were intelligent enough to see through those kinds of pamphlets, this kind of deceit. They managed to persuade enough other people to change their minds about the idea of women's suffrage. And the 19th Amendment, which did that, was finally ratified in 1920, and the only reason that it happened, that it got ratified in 1920, is because one young man in Tennessee decided to listen to his mother. It all came down to Tennessee. The last vote that was needed to ratify the 19th Amendment was going to happen in Tennessee, if it was going to happen at all at that time. And the state legislature was evenly divided, 48 in favor and 48 against, which meant that it couldn't pass. Except for one thing, the guy who changed his mind. This guy right here, Harry Byrne, a very good boy. A very good boy. The day of the vote, he was wearing a red rose in his lapel, which signified that he was on the team that was against the ratification of the amendment. Everybody who was voting in favor, they were on the team of voting in favor. They were Team Yellow Rose. So you had Team Yellow Rose in favor, Team Red Rose against. But he had just received a 7-page letter from his mother. I'm going to give you a little excerpt from it here. This is cute. She says, "Dear son, hurrah and vote for suffrage and don't keep them in doubt. I noticed Chandler's speech. It was very bitter. I've been watching to see how you stood, but haven't seen anything yet. Don't forget to be a good boy and help Mrs. Thomas Cat with her rats. Is she the one that put rat in ratification? Ha! No more from Mama this time. With lots of love, Mama." So he tucks that letter into his jacket pocket, and still wearing his red rose, he goes out and he votes in favor of ratifying the 19th Amendment, and the rest, as they say, is history. Yes. Don't you love it, though? That part about Mrs. Cat with the rats, that was Mama making a joke. Mrs. Cat was a reference to Carrie Chapman Catt, who was a major leader in the suffrage movement. So, get it? A cat putting the rat in ratification. You know, you've heard of dad jokes, right? Yeah. Well, that was a mom joke, right? Be a good boy, Harry. The moral of the story is that words are powerful. Don't be afraid to speak up and ask for what you want. And you don't have to threaten or be a demagogue or engage in bullying either. You know, you never know what kind of a positive effect some words and maybe a little lame humor is going to have. And I know some folks might be thinking, well, gee, if the amendment wasn't passed then in 1920, it would have eventually been passed. Probably true, but just not good enough, is it? Because there's this well-known legal maxim that I learned when I was practicing, which says that justice delayed is justice denied. So, way to go, Mom. Thanks to Phoebe Byrne, and here she is. I got a picture of Phoebe there. Phoebe Byrne, Mama knows best, and her son Harry. Justice was no longer delayed or denied. So when I first started talking today, I mentioned the idea of finding ways to honor our mothers and mother figures, and I wasn't trying to engage in some form of political correctness, just an acknowledgement of the fact that there are many people for whom today is difficult. There are many people for whom today may bring up some unpleasant memories. There may be people who didn't know their biological mother or had no meaningful relationship with a nurturing mother or mother figure, or had a difficult or dysfunctional relationship with their mother. And so for that reason, I like to add the possibility for Mother's Day that let's include women who inspire us. Women role models who inspire us, like Phoebe Byrne, right? She's certainly one of them, but there was someone else whose name came up in her letter, who can also serve as a role model. That's Carrie Chapman Catt, the cat who put the rat in ratification. She came from a small town in Wisconsin, born there in 1859. There she is. She was the director of an organization called the National American Women's Suffrage Association, and she took over that position after another name that you'll recognize, Susan B. Anthony, retired from that position. So she stepped in. And then after the 19th Amendment was ratified, she went on to found the League of Women Voters, which is still operating today quite powerfully. And if that weren't enough, once the vote was secured, once the 19th Amendment was ratified, she turned her attention and her talent to the peace movement, because it wasn't long after the 20th Amendment was passed, the 19th Amendment was passed shortly after the horrors of World War I, and then very quickly leading into the horrors of World War II. So she organized a group known as the Protest Committee of Non-Jewish Women Against the Persecution of Jews in Germany. Kind of a long title, but it really explains exactly what they were up to. One of her major achievements was to persuade the U.S. government to ease immigration laws so Jews could more easily take refuge in America. And for her efforts, she became the first woman to receive the American Hebrew Medal. Another thing that she can teach us is a little something about the importance of self-care. She stepped down from her leadership responsibilities early on in the women's suffrage movement back in 1904. She stepped down because her husband was dying and she wanted to take care of him. Well, he passed in 1905, but at about that same time, her brother, her mother, and then her mentor and role model Susan B. Anthony all died within that year, leaving her emotionally and physically drained. So what she did was she went to Europe. And she took some time off and went traveling in Europe, and took the time that she needed to take in order to heal. And when she came back in 1915, that's when she devised the strategy that led to the passage of the 19th Amendment. Now, think about what would have happened if she'd have burned out earlier, decided not to take the time off, burned out earlier in dedication to the cause. It could have been justice delayed. So one of the things we learned from her is that it's important to know when you need to take a vacation. Now, someone else I want to talk about this morning, who I think was really responsible for laying the groundwork for what Carrie Chapman Catt and Susan B. Anthony would accomplish later, is this woman here, Sojourner Truth. She laid the foundation. And we hear the name, but I don't know if we learn all that much about her. You go to Wikipedia, and it's pretty amazing. You look her up, and you will find something like 45 different honors and commemorations over the years. I mean, things like statues and buildings named after her. They named a Mars rover after her, Sojourner Truth. All kinds of things like that. That's not bad for someone who never learned how to read or write. Now, as you might expect, she was born a slave in the North, in New York. Her birth name was Isabella Baumfree. And it wasn't until she was in her late 20s that she managed to escape slavery with the help of an abolitionist family in New York. And then after that, she went to work for a minister in New York City. And she got caught up in this religious revival movement. It was called the Second Awakening, and it was happening in upstate New York back in those days, this huge religious revival movement. And you know, there must have been something in the water in that area, okay? Because that area of New York, central and western New York, gave us the Book of Mormon, the Millerites, the Shakers, as well as these abolitionist groups, and it was the birthplace of the suffrage movement, Seneca Falls, New York. This area had an interesting label that journalists placed on it. They called it the Burned Over District. The Burned Over District, because of the heat of the fervor that seemed to be ignited there by these different groups. So Isabella gets caught up in this, and she becomes convinced that God wanted her to leave New York City, and go into the countryside and preach the truth, which is what led her to change her name at that time to Sojourner Truth, called by God to go out and speak the truth. And that's what she did, and she was really, really good at it. Started out preaching against the evils of slavery, caught the attention of Frederick Douglass, who encouraged her to do that. Later on, she met Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, and she took up the cause of women's rights. Now, this is all happening in the 1850s, okay? This is before the Civil War started. And I mentioned before that she couldn't read or write, so what she did was she dictated a book. Dictated her autobiography that was called The Narrative of Sojourner Truth. And by the standards of the day, the book became a bestseller. In fact, it sold well enough to provide her with an income that she could live on. So she was free to go out, tour around the country, giving speeches and appearing at rallies and things like that. It gave her national recognition, which helped a lot on the lecture tour. And despite her pacifist leanings, she did help to recruit black troops for the Union Army, which caught the attention of Abraham Lincoln, who met with her in 1864. She was also one of the first, and I would say probably the first, freedom riders. She went to Washington, D.C., and again, these were in the days before the Civil War, and she rode on the segregated streetcars there. And there was this one racist conductor who tried to physically block her from getting on the streetcar, reportedly dislocating her arm. So what does she do? She calls the police. They arrested him. She persuaded the police to arrest him, and then she sued him, and she won. That was one of 3 different lawsuits that she brought against white men that she won in court. The first case she brought was to recover her son, who was illegally sold as a slave while she was living in New York. And this is an interesting one. The second case that she won was a slander suit that she filed against someone who had accused her of poisoning a couple of people who were part of this religious group that she was involved in. They were the followers of this preacher who claimed to be the reincarnation of Elijah. And supposedly he died under suspicious circumstances, and a bunch of people were accused of killing him or poisoning him. And she was accused of being involved in that. And she brought a slander suit, which she won. She wasn't afraid to stand up for herself. Even in a time when more than half the country believed that you had no rights if you were a woman, you had no rights if you were a black person, heaven help you if you were both. She lived to see slavery abolished, but it would take another 37 years for women to get the vote. That was a really dangerous thing for people. It can be a slow process, but justice is inevitable. You know, earlier I showed you that anti-suffrage pamphlet, that cringeworthy pamphlet with all of those ridiculous reasons for denying women the excuse me, the right to vote. You know, we look back on those things and think, how could they have possibly been so bigoted and thoughtless? If you need a reminder, I got another one here. Let's see if we got this other one. Yeah, housewives, you do not need a ballot to clean your sink spout. Why vote for pure food laws when your husband does that? See? We see this stuff and we look back and we think, how could they have been so bigoted and thoughtless? So maybe in closing today we might consider what's happening today that people will call bigoted and thoughtless 50 years from now. Maybe we can start to get ahead of that curve in honor of Sojourner Truth and all of those people who made it a reality. Let's make Mom proud. Carry on the tradition of our inspirational mother figure role models. Happy Mother's Day, y'all. See you next week.